All right, we're finishing off Matthew. Um, Seems to be going quick, doesn't it? So we're 27, 28, starting with Jesus handed over to Pilate. So this is fairly straightforward. It talks about Judas, where he was paid 30 pieces of silver, throws it back at them, and, uh, and commits suicide, basically. Um, so that is pretty straightforward. But then you have Jesus in front of Pilate, which is sort of a neat situation because um, Pilate sort of tries to absolve himself from guilt, although he does not do what is right. So he's not really absolved of guilt. But it's an interesting back and forth. So where he comes to him and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And it's roughly like this in all the Gospels. Phrase like this, at least pretty clear: Matthew, Mark, Luke. Um, and Jesus answered him, "You say so," or basically, "It is so," is what he's really. We've already gone over this. That phrase can be sort of an affirmative, right? And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he didn't answer. And Pilate said to him, "Don't you hear how much they are testifying against you?" But he didn't answer on even one charge. So the governor was quite amazed. That is because if you don't give a defense by default, you're saying you're guilty, right? So if you don't answer, what he's saying is, fair enough, I'm guilty. It is what it is, right? So we have that. Sorry, we have that situation. So there is a festival coming up, and Pilate, I presume, probably thinks, "Hey, this is a chance to kind of uh, get out of this. Who would you like me to release? This noted murderer Barabbas, or Christ?" For it says even right here, for he knew it was because of envy that they handed him over. And while sitting on the bench, his wife sent word to him and said, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. Um, I've suffered a dream because of him," right? Um, and when it comes down to it, he asked, and they say Barabbas. And he says, "What should I do with Jesus?" And they say, "Crucify him." And Pilate answers, "Why? What has he done wrong?" But they kept shouting, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead, um, he has to avoid a riot. So basically, washes his hands in front of the crowds and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood." Um, and interesting, all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." And basically, he sends Jesus off to be flogged, to be crucified. So this sort of continues on through that chapter 23, 24, 25, where Jesus is really saying that's what's going to happen. He's like, you have rejected me, and the blood of the prophets is on your hands. And here they are saying, that's right. That blood is on our hands. You can't say it wasn't knowingly done, right? So then the military mocks him. But the crazy part is, so what happens to Jesus in this whole process is, he is treated as a king. He's called the king. Even outsiders understand that something is going on here, right? With this man, he's given a robe, he's given a crown, he's lifted up on high with a sign over him that says "King of the Jews." But all done by those who hate him, that those who are rejecting him in mockery, without realizing, that they're actually, putting a robe and a crown and lifting on high the actual king. So fascinating sort of section of the Bible that you're going through. So then they put Jesus up between two criminals. Um, Great stories. And they tried to give him gall to drink. Some people think that that would sort of numb the pain, and that's why he didn't want to do that. But they put a sign over his head. This is a normal thing. They would usually put a sign somewhere on the cross to say, somewhere on the crucifixion to say what it was. So that's actually interesting. Side note is some crucifixions were done on an X, and some are done on a cross. And one of the ways for sure that this was a cross, it says because they hung the charge above him. If you're on an X, there is no above him. So in order to be able to hang the sign, it must have been a cross and not an X. So you see right here, The people that are coming by say, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross," right? That's actually the exact same wording, if you remember back at the beginning of the chapter, chapter 4, the words of Satan when he's tempting him in the desert. If you really are the Son of God, right, then you could do this and you could do that. Probably not coincidentally, the people right when Jesus is probably at his lowest on the cross, probably not enjoying himself as he's there, right? They come up and say, "If you really are the Son of God," the exact same tempting that Satan did when he was hungry in the wilderness, or being challenged in the wilderness. So, and then I would encourage you to read Psalm 22 if you want to do a little bit of a cross study. You know, obviously we got a lot of reading to do if you're going through all this. So if you can't, that's okay. But Psalm 22 has a whole section. And it starts out with the very first line is, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And the psalm talks about how he'll be pierced through his hands, and they'll split up his clothes. There's a whole bunch of the details from this crucifixion show up in Psalm 22. It was almost like it was written by someone watching this going on. So it's worth reading, but it is an intentional sort of callback to that Psalm 22 intentionally, to say, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And what does he mean by "why have you abandoned me"? This is the whole point of the crucifixion. When you die, we talk about, the death as in you die, but if you've got an eternal soul and you are going to be with Jesus and going into heaven, you're not really dying in what we call dying, right? A lot of times when they're talking about death, it starts in the garden, right? It says, "If you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will certainly die." And then they eat of it and they don't really die. What happens? They're separated from God. They're suddenly separated away from God and moved on, and they eventually do die. And that is part of the curse. But there's this separation that happens, and that's what this is about right here, right? God has to go through, Jesus has to go through the process of dying, of actually being separated from God. So he doesn't say Father. Generally, Jesus always says Father, right? He doesn't say, my God, my God. He's quoting that Psalm too, but he's also basically stepping back and saying, I am separated from God for the first time. That's the real sacrifice when he came down to us and he died on the cross, is that being separated from God. They say he's calling for Elijah. We sort of went over Elijah and John the Baptist a little bit when we're doing that. So, and then Jesus passes and he gives up his spirit, and suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. So you'll hear people, if you're new to the faith, maybe you don't understand that a whole bunch, right? The Holy of Holies is in the back of the sanctuary, and there's this giant curtain, like giant. When we say giant, some people estimate it's like a foot thick. It's a giant curtain in the new rebuilt temple. The temple is massive, so the curtain, in order to separate the two, was estimated to be, I don't know, hundreds of pounds, even like tons of material, and it was torn in two because there is no longer a separation between us and God. Right? We now have immediate access through Christ to God. Right? That's sort of the whole point of this new covenant. So when Jesus dies, that veil is torn because we no longer are separated from the Holy of Holies. So you'll hear people saying that a lot when they have that. And of course, the men that are watching over Jesus say, truly, this man was the Son of God. So then Jesus is buried. They decide to put a guard on his tomb. And then we come to resurrection morning. So they go to view the tomb, and there is an earthquake, and an angel of the Lord rolled back the stone, and there's no one in there. What do you know, right? So in Matthew, it doesn't spend too much time on the post-resurrection Jesus, not as much time. So it just sort of says that send them to Galilee and I'll go meet them. And that the soldiers were bribed to lie, and that Jesus does appear to his 11 disciples. And when they saw him, they worshiped him. One of the most important lines in the Bible. I guess if you try to rate some as more important than others, Probably not a great idea to start doing that in the Bible, but you know what I mean. A very important line. Jesus comes to them and says, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." So that is the Great Commission. So there's a sort of a spectrum of looking at that. I won't say two ways of looking at it because both sides, I think, have a little of both. But sort of interpreting this, what probably many, if you're a dispensational in particular, which is what a lot of evangelicals are in the U.S., quite a few, you would look at that as go therefore and make disciples of all nations, meaning make disciples in each of the nations, baptizing them and teaching them to observe everything. So teaching them the way, build churches and stuff like that. So it's a very mission-based mindset to sort of say, it is our job to go to all the nations and make disciples and make little churches and things like that. On the sort of post-millennial side, maybe, and even the amillennial a little bit, which is also a normal traditional view, would emphasize a little bit more this: all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That means all authority is Jesus's. Go therefore, and where it says make disciples, you can also translate this and disciple all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. So they would emphasize a little bit more on the we are trying to disciple the nations. Like all of the nations should be discipled to Christ, bring everything under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So they would have a little bit more of an emphasis on discipling where you are. So both of them, post-millennials, obviously have missions. They go out, they do all the things. People who are dispensational obviously want to have more of Christ over more of their life. So neither of them are here is the answer. It's just a change in emphasis in that Great Commission and the way people sort of interpret it or take it to heart and what they do with it. So that is it for Matthew. And remember, he is with us always to the end of the age. Good way to finish off, right? All right. God bless.